Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, a free site, bettingangle.us, a free site. It's Saturday, August the 5th. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Well, it looks like the Anthony Joshua, Dillian Whyte rematch is not going to happen. Apparently, something was wrong. Some anomaly was found in Dillian Whyte's sample, right? Understand the way today's drug tests work. They can look at the drug test, and if they see something there that shouldn't be there, that conceivably could mask steroid use, like female drugs to have children, right? You'd be surprised. Female fertility drugs sometimes are used to mask steroids. Or if they see too high a testosterone epitestosterone ratio. The drug testers today know that that anomaly indicates the likelihood of illegal drug use. So they might not be able in this moment to spot the PED that Dillian Whyte might be taking. But what they know is that something isn't right. And in a combat sport where literally these men are putting their lives on the line against professional prize fighters, in a sport with high risks, where the goal, one of them at least, is to knock the other man unconscious. To be in the ring against someone who's artificially enhanced is just too much of a risk. Let me say this too. Dillian Whyte, fairly or unfairly, has had past problems with drug tests, right? He's already been suspended in the past. He had another problem with drug tests, and they allowed his fight against Oscar Rivas to go forward, right? And so just understand, Dillian Whyte has had problems in the past. At this point of his career, you think the brother would just be eating organic foods, right? But let's remember, this is a clenbuterol sport, right? Big names failing, clenbuterol tests, having that swept under the rug. This is a clenbuterol sport where people are cutting corners. So just be aware of the fact that the Anthony Joshua fight has been called, and it's going to have repercussions because Joshua is supposed to fight Deontay Wilder later this year. Joshua has a trainer who he hasn't had a lot of fights with, right? Derek James. They don't have a multi-year history. Joshua, of course, is trying to get himself back in the saddle. That Jermaine Franklin fight left many feeling that Joshua was too tentative in that fight. Did not look his best. Hall of Famers like Carl Froch came out and asked the question, does Joshua still want to fight? So against that backdrop of uncertainty, Joshua had a great opportunity here to prove that he was back in the saddle against Dillian Whyte, a guy he knocked out before. And it looks like that fight is now off. That's breaking news. Please follow up on that story. It has huge implications for the heavyweight division because understand, life is unfair, rightly or wrongly. Joshua is one of the cash cows of the heavyweight division. Let me just say this too, and I've seen this many times. A fighter has a slump, right? People start to doubt the fighter. Questions like, does he still have it? Start to come out of the woodwork. Teofimo Lopez, for example, himself, on camera asked himself, do I still have it? Right? Well, just understand, these cash cow fighters, while we question them, during bad times, during rainy days, the minute the guy shows you that he's aware of the criticism and that he's taking steps to right the ship, right? He has found the umbrella, so to speak, to stop the rain. The minute a Ray Leonard rededicates himself to the sport after losing to Duran the first time, right? I guess that's the only time he lost to Duran, and vindicates himself with the rematch, I'm just telling you, the crowd comes back. Right? Teofimo Lopez revalidated himself by beating Josh Taylor. Anthony Joshua is very close to returning to the throne in terms of box office pull in the heavyweight division. Right? I need for people to understand that being Mr. Box Office in a division, as Gervonta Davis is at 135, doesn't necessarily mean that you're the best fighter in the division or you've done the most in the division. It just means that the fans love you. Right? We understand that to get back to the top of the mountain from a fighting standpoint, Joshua has unfinished business with Usyk, at least unfinished from the Joshua side of the ledger, right? The Usyk people will say, we beat the brother twice. What more do you want from us? Right? But obviously, Joshua wants to beat Usyk if he's going to follow the Lennox Lewis blueprint of beating everyone who's beaten you in your career. He has unfinished business with Usyk. Of course, the mountain is Tyson Fury. Right? Fellow UKer. Right? Certainly Joshua has some mountains to climb to get back on top. One of them, of course, is Deontay Wilder, who he should have fought when both of them were unbeaten with belts. Right? But make no mistake, I understand people are saying the crowd was a little bit soft for the Jermaine Franklin fight. You're hearing stuff about they had to really give away tickets and stuff like that. There wasn't the same enthusiasm. I'm just telling you that had Joshua looked good against Dillian Whyte, the sellout for the Deontay Wilder fight would have happened in a matter of hours. Right? As it is, I'm expecting his fight against Wilder to be a financial blockbuster. Right? So Joshua, to me at least, is still a big name with big-time commercial viability in the heavyweight division, the glamour division of boxing. Right? Just be aware that his fight against Dillian Whyte right now is off because of something abnormal with Dillian Whyte's sample. Let's talk about the big secret, and it's a big secret, in the Jake Paul-Nate Diaz fight. Right? I'm on the sidelines for this fight. I understand Jake Paul is coming off a loss. I know that Nate Diaz is a big-time warrior and is getting great odds. But I'm on the sidelines for this fight because the big secret here is that Nate Diaz is a guy who for years, has hung around boxing gyms. Right? There are boxers out there who, showed up to their gym and saw Nate Diaz there, training as a boxer. Diaz is that guy who has an avid interest in boxing that far predates Jake Paul. Right? So those are the guys I'm cautious and wary of. Understand too, I believe Jake Paul is real. Jake Paul's straight right hand to me is an A-level punch. I also understand too that both of these men, both Paul and Diaz, are serious about what they do. Jake Paul is a mogul, folks. Jake Paul has a hedge fund, the Anti-Fund. Jake Paul is actively involved in pay-per-view negotiations and things like that. He has put together a team. He's really a CEO. You need to understand Nate Diaz is always prepared for fights. Right? Diaz isn't quite the mogul that Jake Paul is, but just understand, as these guys are hooting and hollering for the camera, as they're having pre-fight brawls and stuff like that, just understand, I view both as serious men. I have no doubt in my mind, and I mean zero doubt in my mind, that both of these guys have trained extremely hard for this fight, are taking it seriously. Understand too, Jake Paul is the kind of guy who has figured out that winning this fight could lead to much bigger money on the back end. In other words, he's the businessman. That's really who he is, far more so than a boxer. He's the businessman who has figured out the economics of the sport. He might only be 26 years old, but he's entering the building on the top floor. Right? So this is a guy who understands that this fight here against Nate Diaz is worth millions of dollars. You can't even judge the fight by the purses the guys are going to receive. You really need to look at the full economic value of the fight and how Jake Paul is doing business with Mark Cuban, who owns the venue where the fight is. They've already announced that this is going to be something like the second biggest pay-per-view event for MMA in the arena. In other words, the fight, at least from a live gate perspective, is already a huge success. And I need for people to realize, as I mentioned in an earlier video, that the financial part of the sport is very different from the fighter's stature versus their peers. So, Ryan Garcia against Gervonta Davis. Admittedly, Davis is one of boxing's biggest cash cows. Netted $30 million for that fight. Right? The pay-per-view numbers for that Ryan Garcia-Gervonta Davis fight dwarf the recent pay-per-view numbers for the Terence Crawford-Errol Spence fight, even though I would say Spence and Crawford were more meaningful champions than Ryan Garcia or Gervonta Davis. Right? Well, you need to realize that Jake Paul is looking at the numbers. How the deal is structured is everything. Jake Paul may have only fought a few times. He's already a fan favorite. Understand too, Nate Diaz, who has received decent money from UFC. I'm not going to diss UFC because they tend to have lower purses than the very top boxing fights, right? I've watched many UFC events. UFC certainly has an active fan base. I will say, if you hit sports bars like I do, you know that UFC events can compete with all but the very top team events like a Super Bowl or something like that in terms of pulling in fans, having fans waiting outside, scarce seats, people cheering, the partisanship, etc. Right? So just understand where they are right now. This is a boxing match. I know I was comparing it to UFC, but Nate Diaz is about to receive possibly the biggest payday of his career. Right? That's how much money is in Jake Paul events. So these guys are professionals at the end of the day. While Jake Paul has a lot of things going on, a lot of business ventures, including an investment in MoonPay if you're a crypto person, right? While Jake Paul has a lot going on, you need to realize that he's very serious about his boxing career. He only has to be right once. Let's remember, he knocks down Tommy Fury. Now, Fury threw a lot of feints at him. Jake Paul looked like a fighter with less than 10 pro fights, right? Couldn't quite handle the feints. He'll address that. We'll see what Nate Diaz does. My point to you, though, is to realize that Nate Diaz is a guy with an active interest in boxing that goes back several years. Nate Diaz has been in the ring training with boxers for years. So I believe you need to know when to say when. I don't have a good read on this fight. Nate Diaz to me is a bit of a black box when it comes to boxing, right? I understand Eddie Hearn had some criticism of Nate Diaz, but you need to understand, in boxing, promoters have their own agendas, right? You can't trust anyone. The only thing you can trust, quite frankly, are your own two eyes, right? I just don't have the film on Nate Diaz to make any prediction with any kind of certainty. So I'm on the sidelines for that fight. Anyway, that's how I see it. If you have a take on Jake Paul, Nate Diaz, I hope you leave it here in the comment section of this video. If I were to speculate, this is pure speculation, on Nate Diaz against Jake Paul, I'm guessing that Paul will realize that the mistake he made, since Paul is a big-time puncher, the mistake he made in the Tommy Fury fight was in watching Tommy Fury and paying attention to Tommy Fury's feints. He should be much more aggressive. In other words, if Nate Diaz comes out and he's trying to feint and stuff like that a lot, a puncher can ignore the feints. A puncher can come in and just start throwing big shots. Let the other guy adjust to you. Right? Tommy Fury, in my opinion, doesn't have a big punch. I'm guessing Jake Paul's going for a KO here. So just off speculation, the bet might be to take Jake Paul by KO and to hedge it with underdog Nate Diaz simply to win. Right? But again, that's a speculation just based on percentages, just based on what I think Jake Paul's mindset is after losing his last fight. Right? Just understand, though, that I don't have a good read on that fight at all. That's how I see it. Let me hear from you. I hope you leave your comments in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.